Telephone. Dinte. Ring. That was the first sign something was catastrophically wrong. It was November 7th, 1983, and inside a reinforced bunker beneath the Kremlin, Soviet Premier Yuri Andropov stared at intelligence reports that suggested the impossible had become inevitable. NATO forces across Western Europe had suddenly gone dark. Communication protocols had shifted. Reconnaissance satellites showed unusual troop movements. Nuclear weapons facilities in West Germany and the United Kingdom were operating at unprecedented alert levels. The Americans were preparing to strike. At least, that's what every indicator told the aging Soviet leader, whose paranoia had been sharpened by years of Cold War tension and his own failing health. The 69-year-old former KGB chief had spent his career studying American behavior, looking for patterns, searching for the telltale signs that would precede a first strike. And now, in the early morning hours of a gray Moscow day, those signs were everywhere. "How long?" Andropov asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of communications equipment filling the command center. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff, consulted his notes with trembling hands. "Our analysts estimate we have between 8 and 24 hours before NATO forces achieve full readiness for a coordinated nuclear assault. 24 hours until the end of the world." What neither Andropov nor his military advisors knew was that there would be no American first strike. No nuclear weapons were being armed for an attack on the Soviet Union. No orders had been given to commence World War III. Instead, NATO forces were conducting the largest command post exercise in the alliance's history, a war game called Able Archer 83, designed to test the procedures for transitioning from conventional to nuclear warfare in the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. It was a simulation, a test, a routine military exercise. But in Moscow, it looked exactly like preparation for the real thing. The tragedy of November 1983 was that both sides had prepared so meticulously for nuclear war that they had created systems perfectly designed to misinterpret peaceful intentions as hostile acts. Every safeguard, every protocol, every carefully rehearsed procedure that was meant to prevent accidental war had instead brought the world to within a hair's breadth of annihilation. And nobody on either side fully understood how close they had come. Asterisk, 3,000 miles to the west, in a nondescript office building in Brussels serving as NATO's supreme headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, American General Bernard Rogers was reviewing the schedule for Able Archer 83 with satisfaction. The exercise was proceeding flawlessly. Communications were crisp. Response times were excellent. The simulated transition from conventional to nuclear release authority had been executed with textbook precision. Rogers had no idea that in Moscow, his exercise was being interpreted as cover for an actual attack. "Sir, we're showing some unusual Soviet activity," reported a junior intelligence officer, gesturing to a series of reconnaissance photos spread across a conference table. "Several Warsaw Pact units have broken from their normal routines. Communications protocols have changed. We're seeing increased activity at nuclear weapon storage sites." Rogers frowned. Increased Soviet alertness during NATO exercises wasn't unprecedented, but something about the scope of these changes felt different. "Are they conducting their own exercise?" "Not that we're aware of, sir. This appears to be in direct response to Able Archer." "Well, that's the point, isn't it?" Rogers replied, though a small knot of concern had begun forming in his stomach. "We're testing our ability to respond to Soviet aggression. Of course, they're going to monitor us closely." What Rogers couldn't know was the compartmentalized nature of Cold War intelligence prevented him from knowing was that the KGB had been receiving alarming reports from deep cover agents embedded throughout Western Europe. These agents, under intense pressure to justify their existence and provide valuable intelligence, had been reporting every unusual detail they observed. A late-night meeting at the Pentagon, extended hours at a nuclear weapons facility, cryptic messages and diplomatic communications. Individually, each report was meaningless. Collectively, they painted a picture of imminent war. And in Moscow, where institutional paranoia had been elevated to a governing principle, those reports were being taken with deadly seriousness. Asterisk. The dangerous dance between NATO and the Warsaw Pact in November 1983 was the culmination of years of mounting tension. The early 1980s had seen the Cold War enter, perhaps its most dangerous phase since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. President Ronald Reagan had taken office with a confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union, which he had famously called an evil empire. The Americans had deployed Pershing II ballistic missiles and cruise missiles II, Western Europe weapons capable of reaching Moscow in less than 10 minutes. The Soviets, for their part, had walked out of arms control negotiations and were deploying their own new generation of nuclear weapons, including the SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missile. On September 1, 1983, Soviet fighters had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard, including a U.S. congressman. The incident had pushed American-Soviet relations to their lowest point in decades. Into this powder keg, NATO introduced Able Archer 83. The exercise had been carefully designed to be as realistic as possible. Unlike previous command post exercises, Able Archer 83 introduced several new elements that made it appear far more threatening to Soviet observers. For the first time, the exercise included encrypted communications formats that had never been seen before. Radio silences were imposed and then broken according to new patterns. The names of scheduled participants were changed at the last minute, with some of the substitutes including higher-ranking officials than originally planned. Most alarmingly, the exercise practiced the procedures for releasing nuclear weapons, including the involvement of heads of government in the authorization process. In previous exercises, this portion had been clearly simulated. In Able Archer 83, the procedures looked identical to what would actually occur if NATO decided to launch nuclear weapons. To NATO planners, these changes represented a more realistic and therefore more valuable training exercise. To Soviet intelligence analysts, they looked exactly like an attempt to mask preparation for an actual attack under the cover of an exercise. It was the perfect trap, and both sides were walking into it blind. Asterisk. 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 As dawn broke over Moscow on November 8th, the Soviet leadership faced an impossible decision. Their intelligence suggested that NATO might be preparing for a first strike, but the evidence was circumstantial. If they waited for more definitive proof, it might be too late. Soviet nuclear forces could be destroyed in their silos before they had a chance to launch. But if they acted preemptively based on faulty intelligence, they would start World War III themselves. The Soviet military doctrine of the era called for launch on warning. If a NATO nuclear attack appeared imminent, Soviet forces would launch their own nuclear weapons before incoming warheads could destroy them. In theory, this policy was meant to deter NATO from ever contemplating a first strike. In practice, it meant that a false alarm could end human civilization. Andropov convened an emergency meeting of the Defense Council. Around the table sat the most powerful men in the Soviet Union, each of them acutely aware that the decisions made in the next hours might determine whether their children and grandchildren would live to see another sunrise. The conference room deep beneath the Kremlin was a study in controlled chaos. Officers rushed between stations, updating maps and status boards with colored pins and grease pencils. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and fear. On the main display, a map of Europe showed NATO force positions in red and Warsaw, packed forces in blue, a visual representation of the fault line that divided the continent, and potentially the line along which civilization might end. Colonel General Vladimir Kryuchkov, head of the KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence, stood before the assembled leadership with a folder of reports that had been compiled over the previous 72 hours. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he began his briefing. Comrades, our sources indicate that NATO exercise Able Archer has deviated significantly from previous command post exercises. Kryuchkov began, his voice steady despite his obvious anxiety. We have confirmation that the exercise has moved beyond simulation and may be transitioning to actual combat operations. Andropov leaned forward. What evidence supports this assessment? Kryuchkov opened his folder, extracting several intelligence reports. First, we have observed a complete change in NATO's communications security protocols. The encryption methods being used are new. We have never seen these formats before. Our signals intelligence teams believe these represent preparations for actual combat operations, not exercise traffic. Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, a veteran of World War II who had overseen the Soviet military-industrial complex for decades, interjected. Could this simply be a new exercise protocol? A test of new communications systems. That was our initial assessment. Khrushchev admitted. However, we have also observed that several high-ranking political leaders who were not originally scheduled to participate in Able Archer have now become involved. In previous exercises, NATO used junior officials to simulate political decisions. This time, we have confirmed that actual government ministers are participating in the command chain. This revelation caused a stir around the table. Marshal Ogarkov stood and approached the map, pointing to various NATO positions. If I were planning a first strike, disguised as an exercise, this is exactly how I would do it. Maintain the appearance of a routine exercise while quietly moving actual decision-makers into position. When the moment arrives, the transition from exercise to combat operations would be seamless. There's more, Khrushchev continued. Our Agent Ryan network has reported unusual activity at multiple NATO nuclear weapons storage facilities. Extended duty hours, movement of specialized equipment, changes in guard rotations. At the Ramstein Air Base in West Germany, our sources indicate that nuclear-capable aircraft have been moved from their normal hangars to forward positions. Agent RYA, an acronym for Raketno-Ядерной Napadin, or nuclear missile attack, was the KGB's most ambitious intelligence operation. Launched in 1981, RYAN tasked agents throughout the Western world with monitoring for signs of preparation for a nuclear first strike. The program was based on the assumption that such preparation would be detectable through careful observation of routine activities, increased hours at government offices, unusual purchases of blood supplies by hospitals, patterns of diplomatic communications. The problem with RYAN was that it had created a massive confirmation bias. Agents under pressure to find evidence of war preparation inevitably found it. Even in the most mundane activities, a late-night meeting at the Pentagon to discuss budget matters became evidence of war planning. Extended hours at a nuclear facility for routine maintenance became proof of weapons preparation. The KGB was drowning in intelligence reports that seemed significant individually, but were actually meaningless noise. And now, that noise was being interpreted as a symphony of imminent war. Asterisk. What the Soviet leadership didn't know, what they couldn't know, given the compartmentalized nature of Western security, was that many of their discoveries about Able Archer 83 had innocent explanations. The new communications protocols were indeed new, but they were being tested precisely because Able Archer was an exercised, a safe environment to experiment with new systems. The involvement of higher-ranking officials was partly accidental, the result of scheduling changes, and partly an attempt to make the exercise more realistic without any intention of actual combat operations. The increased activity at nuclear weapons facilities was real, but it was part of routine maintenance cycles that happened to coincide with the exercise. The movement of nuclear-capable aircraft at Ramstein was related to a separate NATO program and had nothing to do with Able Archer 83. But from Moscow, these innocent coincidences formed a pattern that looked terrifyingly like preparation for war. Lieutenant General Anatoly Grin, who had served as a Soviet advisor during the Cuban Missile Crisis and understood better than most how close the world could come to nuclear war through misunderstanding, spoke up cautiously. Comrade General Secretarial, we must consider the possibility that we are seeing what we expect to see, rather than what is actually happening. During the Caribbean crisis in 1962, we too conducted military exercises that the Americans misinterpreted as preparation for invasion. Perhaps NATO is making the same mistake we made conducting a realistic exercise without fully appreciating how threatening it appears to the other side. Andropov's expression was unreadable. He had authorized the Ryan program himself, convinced that the aggressive rhetoric and military buildup of the Reagan administration indicated a dangerous shift in American thinking. Reagan had joked on an open microphone about bombing Russia, had called the Soviet Union evil, had deployed new missiles to Europe that could strike Moscow in minutes. To Andropov's suspicious mind, these were not the actions of a defensive power, but of one preparing for war. What you suggest is possible, Andropov finally replied. But can we afford to gamble our survival on that possibility? If we wait for absolute certainty and the Americans strike first, there will be no second chance. Our nuclear forces will be destroyed in their silos, our command and control decapitated, our ability to retaliate eliminated. This was the terrible logic of nuclear deterrence. Both sides possessed weapons capable of destroying civilization, but those weapons were only useful if the enemy believed you would actually use them. And to be credible, your response had to be swift, so swift But there wasn't time for careful analysis or diplomatic clarification. The paradox was that the very speed required to make deterrence work also made catastrophic accidents nearly inevitable. "We should increase our alert status," Marshal Ogarkov recommended. "Put our nuclear forces on heightened readiness. If NATO sees that we are prepared to respond, it may cause them to reconsider their plans. Or it may convince them that we are preparing to strike first," General Gribkov countered. "Our increased readiness could be interpreted as exactly the kind of preparation they would expect to see before a Soviet first strike. We could start an escalatory spiral that neither side can control." Andropov rubbed his temples, where a headache was beginning to throb. He was dying. Kidney disease was slowly killing him, though few outside his inner circle knew how severe his condition had become. The medications he took affected his judgment, made him more irritable, more suspicious. This was not the man who should be making decisions about nuclear war, but history had placed him in this position at this critical moment. "Increase our alert status," Andropov ordered, "but do so quietly. I want our nuclear forces ready to launch on warning, but I do not want to provoke NATO unnecessarily. Marshal Ogarkov, you will prepare options for a preemptive strike should it become necessary." At the National Security Agency's listening post in Bad Aibling, West Germany, Sergeant Michael Torres stared at his monitor in disbelief. The 23-year-old signals intelligence analyst had been tracking Soviet military communications for 18 months, and he had never seen anything like the traffic patterns now flooding across his screen. "Chief, you need to see this," Torres called out, waving over his shift supervisor. Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Chun approached, coffee mug in hand, expecting another routine report. What she saw on Torres's screen made her set the mug down carefully, as if sudden movement might somehow make the situation worse. "How long has this been going on?" "Started about 3 hours ago," Torres replied, highlighting several communication intercepts. "Multiple Soviet nuclear units have changed their encryption protocols. We're seeing unscheduled communications between missile command centers and field units. Radio traffic is increased by approximately 300% compared to normal levels." Chun felt her pulse quicken. "Are they conducting an exercise?" "Not that we're aware of, Chief. And the timing is suspicious. This started right after we entered the nuclear release phase of Able Archer." Chun reached for the secure phone. "I'm calling this up to Yukon. Keep monitoring and document everything." Within 2 hours, reports of unusual Soviet military activity were flowing into NATO headquarters from multiple sources. Reconnaissance satellites showed increased activity at Soviet ICBM sites. Signals intelligence detected changes in Soviet naval communications in the Baltic and Black Seas. Ground-based radar stations reported that Soviet air defense networks had shifted to a higher state of alert. In the operations center at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, the atmosphere had shifted from the routine confidence of a well-executed exercise to something far more tense. General Bernard Rogers stood before a wall of monitors displaying real-time intelligence feeds, his earlier satisfaction replaced by growing concern. "Are we certain this isn't part of their own exercise?" Rogers asked his intelligence chief, Air Force Brigadier General James Polk. "Sir, we've checked with all available sources," Polk replied, his voice tight. "The Soviets have not announced any exercises. This appears to be a genuine alert response, and the timing suggests it's a direct reaction to Able Archer." Rogers felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. In his 35 years of military service, he had participated in dozens of exercises designed to prepare NATO forces for potential conflict with the Warsaw Pact. Never before had the Soviets responded with anything approaching this level of concern. "They think it's real," Rogers said quietly, the realization settling over him like a dark cloud. They think Able Archer is cover for an actual attack. The implications were staggering. If the Soviets genuinely believed NATO was preparing to strike, they might decide to launch their own preemptive attack. Soviet military doctrine explicitly called for striking first rather than absorbing a NATO nuclear attack and trying to respond from the ruble. The exercise that was meant to demonstrate NATO's readiness to defend itself was instead convincing the Soviets that they needed to attack immediately. Rogers turned to his communications officer. "Get me a secure line to the Pentagon. I need to speak with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs immediately. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk at the Pentagon." General John Vesey Jr., chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was awakened at 3:47 a.m. by a phone call from Brussels. By 4:30 a.m., he was in the National Military Command Center, surrounded by senior military officers and intelligence analysts, all trying to assess the rapidly evolving situation in Europe. "How confident are we that this is a genuine alert and not a Soviet exercise?" Vesey asked. Studying the intelligence report spread across the conference table. "High confidence, sir," replied the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. "We're seeing patterns consistent with actual alert procedures, not exercise protocols. The Soviets are preparing their forces for potential combat operations." Vesey, a veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, had survived more than his share of crises, but this felt different. The speed at which the situation was developing, the potential for a catastrophic misunderstanding, the knowledge that hundreds of nuclear weapons were involved, all of it created a uniquely dangerous moment. "What's the status of Able Archer?" Vesey asked. "The exercise is continuing as planned, sir. We're currently in the phase that simulates the NATO decision-making process for nuclear release. And that's what's spooking the Soviets," Vesey said, more to himself than to the room. "They're watching us practice the procedures for starting a nuclear war, and they think we're actually doing it." One of the intelligence analysts spoke up. "Sir, there's another factor to consider. Our sources indicate that Soviet leadership is genuinely paranoid about a NATO first strike. They've been running an intelligence program called Ryan, specifically designed to detect preparation for such an attack. It is possible their intelligence collection is creating false positives. They re-seeing what they expect to see rather than what is actually happening. This was the fundamental problem with intelligence analysis during the Cold War. Both sides had constructed elaborate systems to detect the warning signs of attack, but those systems were so sensitive that they risked seeing threats that didn't exist. The Soviets were looking for evidence of American attack preparations with such intensity that they were finding it everywhere, even in routine activities. "We need to get a message to Moscow," Vesey said. "We need to make it clear that Able Archer is just an exercise. We can't compromise the security of our communications protocols," objected one of the NATO liaison officers. "If we reveal details about Able Archer to reassure the Soviets, we'll be giving away classified information about our actual war plans." Vesey gave him a hard look. "If we don't find a way to de-escalate this situation, our actual war plans won't matter because we'll all be dead. Find a way to communicate with Moscow that does uncompromised security but makes it absolutely clear we're not preparing to attack." The problem was that there was no good way to do that. The hotline between Washington and Moscow, the famous Red phone. That was actually a teletype. Machine was designed for direct communication between the American president and the Soviet premier, but using it now would require waking President Reagan, briefing him on an incredibly complex situation, and hoping that whatever message he sent wouldn't make things worse. And there was another complication. The Reagan administration had spent the past 3 years pursuing a confrontational policy toward the Soviet Union, deliberately increasing military pressure to force concessions on arms control and other issues. Many officials in Washington believed that keeping the Soviets off balance and fearful was good strategy. The idea that American actions might actually provoke a Soviet first strike seemed absurd to them. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In London, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was receiving her own briefing on the situation from the Joint Intelligence Committee. Unlike some of her advisors, Thatcher took the Soviet concern seriously. She had studied the history of World War I and understood how easily great powers could stumble into catastrophic wars through miscalculation and misunderstanding. "Are the Soviets genuinely worried, or is this posturing?" Thatcher asked Sir Geoffrey Howe, her foreign secretary. "Our assessment is that the concern is genuine, Prime Minister," Howe replied. The Soviets appear to believe that Abel Archer may be cover for actual attack preparations. Thatcher stood and walked to the window of 10 Downing Street, looking out at the London dawn. Then we need to make it clear to them that they're wrong. What are our options? We could use diplomatic channels to assure the Soviets that Abel Archer is merely an exercise, suggested one of her advisors, and they would believe us. Thatcher's tone was skeptical. If I were in Moscow, convinced that NATO was about to attack, would I believe diplomatic assurances, or would I assume they were part of the deception? The room fell silent. She had identified the core problem. Once a crisis based on mistrust begins, every attempt to resolve it can be interpreted as further evidence of hostile intent. There's another consideration, Prime Minister, Howe said carefully. If we modify or cancel Abel Archer in response to Soviet pressure, it could be seen as weakness. It might encourage the Soviets to use similar intimidation tactics in future exercises. Thatcher turned from the window, her expression hard. I'm not concerned about appearing weak, Jeff. I'm concerned about whether my grandchildren will live to see their 10th birthdays. If continuing this exercise risks nuclear war, then the exercise needs to change. She picked up the phone. Get me President Reagan. Asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk. The transatlantic call between Reagan and Thatcher on the morning of November 9th, 1983, was one of several urgent consultations taking place between NATO leaders as the crisis deepened. During a high-level review at the executive offices, senior leadership evaluated information received from international partners. External assessments indicated elevated concern regarding the interpretation of a previously scheduled multinational training activity. Briefing materials summarized observed changes in coordination patterns, communication structures, and organizational behavior among various institutions. These observations were accompanied by analytical profiles highlighting differences in perception between leadership groups, shaped by historical experience and institutional culture. Advisors noted that long-standing assumptions and prior public positioning may have influenced how routine activities were being interpreted externally. Emphasis was placed on the importance of acknowledging perception gaps, particularly when activities are viewed through differing strategic frameworks. Following internal consultation, leadership agreed that the training activity should continue with procedural adjustments, aimed at improving clarity and reducing ambiguity. Relevant coordinators were instructed to implement modifications focused on transparency, consistency, and predictability. Additional outreach through established diplomatic channels was authorized to reinforce mutual understanding. Subsequent discussions within advisory teams examined how emphasis on demonstration of capability, when not balanced with contextual explanation, could unintentionally contribute to heightened concern among external observers. It was acknowledged that actions intended to convey stability could be interpreted differently depending on prior expectations. Parallel to these deliberations, information-sharing processes within intelligence organizations were reviewed. Analysts identified a pattern in which data collection efforts had become closely aligned with predefined indicators. This alignment increased the risk of reinforcing existing assumptions rather than encouraging objective reassessment. One senior intelligence officer provided an internal briefing highlighting the importance of interrupting feedback loops. In analytical reporting, the briefing emphasized that when organizations are directed to validate a predetermined interpretation, routine activity may be elevated beyond its actual significance. This assessment was communicated through appropriate channels and incorporated into broader situational reviews. Decision-makers were advised that continued monitoring, combined with restraint and clarification, offered a more reliable basis for evaluation than accelerated judgment based on partial information. As coordination efforts progressed, leadership maintained focus on process stability, communication, consistency, and proportional response. Ongoing reviews were scheduled to ensure alignment between stated intent and observable activity. During a scheduled internal briefing, senior officials reviewed recent international developments. Timeframes and projected scenarios were discussed as part of routine strategic monitoring. It was noted that the situation could evolve over the coming hours, requiring continued observation and careful assessment. The presiding official reflected briefly on prior experience in public administration and intelligence oversight, recognizing the importance of measured analysis when addressing complex and evolving circumstances. Attention then turned to information received through established diplomatic channels. Representatives confirmed that a previously announced multinational training activity was proceeding as planned. Additional transparency measures were offered to reduce the possibility of misinterpretation and to support mutual understanding. Participants acknowledged that open communication does not always provide full situational visibility, particularly when information is distributed across multiple organizational layers. As a result, emphasis was placed on context, verification, and proportional interpretation of available data. One senior intelligence official presented a supplementary review of recent reports. He noted that certain observed patterns, while notable, could also be consistent with standard administrative and organizational processes. Extended schedules, internal coordination efforts, and logistical adjustments were identified as examples of activity that may occur under normal operating conditions. The group discussed the importance of avoiding conclusions based solely on predefined indicators. It was agreed that data points should be evaluated collectively and with attention to alternative explanations. Following the discussion, leadership agreed on a measured approach. Formal clarification would be requested through appropriate channels, and existing procedures would remain unchanged. Ongoing monitoring would continue, with adjustments considered only if new, verifiable information emerged. In parallel, partner organizations confirmed that the training activity would continue with minor procedural clarifications. Routine operations outside the scope of the exercise remained unchanged. Subsequent reviews indicated that observed activities aligned with previously communicated plans. Analysts noted increased consistency between reported information and expected operational patterns. As the scheduled activity concluded, all parties returned to standard routines. The process was completed without public notice and was recorded as a routine coordination event within existing frameworks. But in classified briefing rooms on both sides of the Iron Curtain, the near catastrophe of November 1983 triggered urgent reassessments of nuclear policy, intelligence, procedures, and crisis management protocols. What had gone wrong? How had a routine military exercise come within hours of triggering World War III? And most importantly, how could such a disaster be prevented in the future? In Washington, President Reagan was profoundly shaken by how close the world had come to nuclear war. His diary entry from November 18, 1983, declassified years later, revealed his thinking. "I feel the Soviets are so defense-minded, so paranoid about being attacked, that without being in any way soft on them, we ought to tell them no one here has any intention of doing anything like that." It was a remarkable admission from a president who had built his foreign policy on confronting Soviet aggression. Reagan had assumed that American military strength would deter Soviet adventurism, that demonstrations of resolve would make war less likely. The Able Archer crisis had revealed a dangerous blind spot. American strength was making the Soviets feel threatened, and threatened nuclear powers were capable of catastrophically irrational decisions. Reagan ordered a comprehensive review of US-Soviet relations and initiated a series of policy changes designed to reduce the risk of accidental war. The first priority was improving communication with Moscow. The hotline between Washington and the Kremlin was upgraded with better technology and clearer protocols for its use. Regular diplomatic contacts were established to discuss military exercises and reduce the risk of misunderstanding. But Reagan went further. He began moderating his public rhetoric about the Soviet Union, softening the confrontational tone that had characterized his first term. Behind the scenes, he authorized his diplomats to explore areas of potential cooperation with Moscow, looking for ways to reduce tensions without compromising Western security interests. The change in approach was subtle but significant. Reagan remained committed to challenging Soviet influence around the world, but he now understood that challenge had to be balanced with reassurance. The goal was to be strong enough to deter Soviet aggression, but not so threatening as to provoke Soviet desperation. ***** In Moscow, the lessons learned from Able Archer 83 were equally profound but manifested differently. The Soviet leadership recognized that their intelligence systems had failed catastrophically, producing false warnings that had nearly caused them to start a nuclear war. But the institutional culture of the Soviet system made it difficult to acknowledge such failures openly, or to implement meaningful reforms. Premier Andropov, whose health continued to deteriorate, ordered a review of the Ryan program. The review concluded that agents had been under too much pressure to report signs of attack preparation, leading them to interpret routine activities as evidence of hostile intent. The program was modified to require more rigorous verification of intelligence before it was reported to Soviet leadership. But the deeper problem, the institutional paranoia that assumed NATO hostility as a baseline assumption, proved harder to address. The Soviet system had been built on the premise that the capitalist West was fundamentally aggressive, and that socialist vigilance was the only thing preventing imperialist attack. Questioning that premise meant questioning the ideological foundation of the Soviet state itself. Marshal Ogarkov, in classified briefings to Soviet military leadership, emphasized a different lesson: the danger of mirror imaging, of assuming that the enemy thinks the way you think. Soviet military doctrine called for using exercises as cover for actual attack preparations, so Soviet analysts assumed NATO would do the same. But NATO doctrine was different, based on different assumptions about the nature of war and the use of nuclear weapons. We nearly destroyed ourselves fighting a war that existed only in our imagination. Ogarkov reportedly told his staff, "We must learn to see the world as it actually is, not as our ideology tells us it must be." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. For the intelligence officers who had witnessed the crisis firsthand, Able Archer 83 became a case study in the dangers of confirmation bias and the importance of challenging assumptions. At the CIA, analysts began developing new methodologies for testing intelligence assessments, specifically designed to avoid the trap of seeing only what you expect to see. One innovation was the red team concept, where analysts were assigned to argue against the prevailing intelligence assessment, looking for alternative explanations and highlighting uncertainties. If the consensus was that Soviet military movements indicated preparation for war, the Red Team would be tasked with developing a case for why those same movements might be innocent exercises or routine activities. The British intelligence services, particularly MI6, conducted their own review with input from Ola Gordievsky, his unique perspective as someone who had witnessed Soviet paranoia from the inside while working for the West provided invaluable insights into how the crisis had developed. Gordievsky's debriefings revealed just how distorted Soviet perceptions of the West had become. KGB officers in Moscow genuinely believed that NATO was capable of launching a surprise nuclear attack, despite the political and military realities that made such an attack nearly impossible. This distortion had been reinforced by decades of Soviet propaganda, by the institutional culture of the KGB, and by the personal paranoia of leaders like Andrew. The tragedy, Gordievsky later reflected, was that both sides were acting rationally according to their own assumptions. But those assumptions were fundamentally wrong. NATO assumed the Soviets understood that Western democracies would never launch a surprise attack. The Soviets assumed that NATO was constantly looking for opportunities to destroy the Soviet Union. Both assumptions seemed obviously true to the people who held them, and both were dangerously mistaken. Asterisk. 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 Asterisk, asterisk. The technical lessons from Able Archer 83 were easier to implement. NATO established new protocols for military exercises conducted near Soviet borders. Advanced notification would be provided through established channels. Exercise scenarios would be designed to be clearly distinguishable from actual war preparations. Communications would include explicit statements that exercises were simulations, not cover for real operations. The Soviets implemented parallel changes. Their intelligence gathering would focus more on verifiable facts and less on interpretation of ambiguous activities. Regular contacts between Soviet and NATO military officers would provide opportunities to clarify intentions and reduce misunderstandings. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. Both sides had looked into the abyss during November 1983 and understood, in a visceral way that abstract analysis could never provide, just how Azali nuclear war could begin through accident or misunderstanding. The knowledge that they had come within hours of destroying civilization focused minds wonderfully. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The impact of Able Archer 83 on subsequent Cold War history is difficult to measure precisely, but many historians consider it a turning point. The crisis helped convince both Reagan and the Soviet leadership that the risks of continued confrontation outweighed any potential benefits. It created momentum for renewed arms control negotiations and for the development of confidence-building measures designed to prevent future misunderstandings. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in Moscow in 1985, he found a Soviet leadership that was more open to dialogue with the West than it had been in years. The trauma of Able Archer 83 had created a constituency for change, a group of officials who understood that the existing confrontation was unsustainable and potentially suicidal. Reagan and Gorbachev's first summit in Geneva in November 1985 almost exactly 2 years after. Able Archer 83 produced a joint statement that captured the lessons both sides had learned. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. It was an acknowledgement that the logic of mutual assured destruction, carried to its extreme, led only to mutual assured insanity. The subsequent thaw in US-Soviet relations, the arms control agreements of the late 1980s, and eventually the end of the Cold War itself, all had multiple causes. But the memory of November 1983, when military exercises nearly triggered World War III, provided a powerful impetus for both sides to find a better way. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Yet the story of Able Archer 83 remained classified 4 years after the crisis ended. The American public didn't learn the full details until the 1990s, when declassified documents revealed how close the world had come to nuclear war. Even today, some aspects of the crisis remain classified, particularly regarding intelligence sources and methods that provided warning of Soviet intentions. This secrecy meant that the public debate about nuclear weapons policy in the 1980s proceeded without full knowledge of the risks being run. Citizens marched for nuclear disarmament, and politicians debated arms control agreements, but few understood that their world had nearly ended not through deliberate aggression, but through mutual misunderstanding and institutional failure. The intelligence officers, military commanders, and political leaders who had lived through the crisis carried the knowledge privately, a burden that shaped their subsequent decisions. Another factor involved interpretive frameworks shaped by long-standing institutional narratives. Institutional memory was also identified as a critical variable. As personnel rotate and leadership changes, first-hand experience with past coordination challenges diminishes.